Afternoon all. Yesterday Adams played a fantastic positional game, exploiting a backward e-pawn in a very systematic manner, crushing, it seemed, all of Black's counterplay on both sides of the board. Let's see how Adams did that. So e4, and then the caro-kann was played by Stuart Conquest, who had won, by the way, the British Championship 2 years ago. We have to go back to 1989 to see where Adams won it. He was very much younger. And so the two British champions really meet in this game. But Adams is the higher rated Grandmaster at 2706, and Stuart is just 2523 at the moment. So anyway, we have the advanced variation, this E5, which previously to a few months ago, I didn't think this variation had too much bite to it. But it does seem to have a lot of bite to it, and a lot of suspense and a lot of tension. So Bishop F5. And, Black, I would have said in the past, gets a kind of improved French defence, with E6 and C5 later. But Adams is proving this is far from simple, this plan to get advantage for Black here. He plays Bishop E2, now Knight D7 was played by Stuart. Castles. Now none of this Bishop E4, which we saw in one of the previous rounds against Summerskull. Bishop G6 was played, with no intention of trying to sort of hit E5 at some point. Black just wants to maybe develop his pieces. Maybe the knight sometimes comes out E7 to F5 and then H5. Sometimes that's a plan. But let's see how Black's going to unravel. Actually, he plays his knight to H6. Now this might be a little bit controversial because it's encouraging Bishop H6, giving up the dark square bishop, but fracturing Black's pawn structure. Now Adams is not tempted here to play bishop takes H6. He actually plays A4, and I think this is designed to discourage Black from queenside counterplay later with C5, because if White can get a pawn to A6, then really the B5 square is going to be weaker than usual if Black ever played C5, and maybe a knight can come in to B5, like even via A3 would be one way to get to B5. So we see Rook C8 and now A5. So Adams is ruthlessly pursuing this discouragement. So C5 maybe A6, and to demonstrate this, I did, this is an engine variation from earlier. So say C5 was played. This is a line I was looking at earlier. So Knight A3 coming into that B5, and although Black could try and take and then take, he'll be weakening his dark squares. So let's assume Black doesn't want to give up the dark square bishop and leave that knight horribly, it seems, on B5. This could get kind of painful for Black later on. This is an advantage for White. There isn't too much counterplay in this sort of position, and this knight's difficult to grab, and this pawn's under pressure, and this pawn's like a useful pawn. So let's go back. So A5, what Stuart plays is actually A6. He doesn't want this to happen. He wants maybe the flexibility to play C5, but Adams now simply plays Bishop F4, again not tempted by Bishop H6. And the major theme which emerges later is this backward e-pawn, because Black is desperate to get some counterplay, and if he can't get counterplay on the queen side, that leaves the king side, and the logical Black would be F6 to try and get F-file pressure. The question is this just a fairy tale, this F-file pressure? If it doesn't actually do anything, then what is Black left with? Black would be left with this backward e-pawn, potential liability, and potentially a losing liability if that pawn, gets snapped up and then we just go into an endgame. Well, it will just be a pawn up. So that would be a nightmare scenario for Black, and it's not unlike what actually turned out in this game. So prepare yourself for that pattern. That where can Black generate counterplay? If it's not C5, it's going to be F6. This would be the base of the pawn chain, and this would be the head of the pawn chain. Well, this would be the closest exploitable base. You can't exploit C3 here, although Adams himself did as Black in a previous round where he played like B4, and he was undermining the real base. But here the most underminable base is D4, so we can assume that it's either C5 or F6. Adams, he plays Rook E1. He doesn't seem to be that bothered actually about Black playing C5 until this position. After Black castles, he now plays quite a committal move actually. He plays B4. And it looks as though yeah, it is shutting down black's possibilities. Like b6 seems out of the question because of that a6 pawn. The knight can't really maneuver anywhere useful. So without c5, where is black's counterplay? So we go for the head of the pawn chain now. Well, Stuart went for the head of the pawn chain, so he played f6. So let's see. White just took now on f6. So we're exposing that backward e pawn on the semi-open file, which, as I mentioned, is potentially a losing liability. So rook takes f6, and now we see the move bishop g5, kicking the rook back to a less useful square where it's not protecting e6. Rook takes f3 here. There's a reasons like bishop e7, not bishop f3, bishop g5. So the rook goes back, and now not bishop e7 actually. Adams decided to give up his dark squared bishop. He took on h6, and you know, maybe that knight would have been useful in the future if that rook had moved to come to f7 to support some other, you know, break, maybe e5. But e5 in this game is also never possible to liberate that pawn. So that pawn is truly backward and fixed, and getting more so with seemingly every move from white. So first Adams plays bishop d3. After bishop h5, he does something about that pin. Okay, there's the first sign there might be some tactical pressure on f3 in particular, and you know, maybe the fairy tale could continue into a successful end with, you know, white getting slaughtered down the f and g files. So is this a fairy tale or is this reality? Well, Adams seems in this game to convincingly crush the counterplay opportunities. After knight f8, he plays rook e5, so he's immediately hitting that h5 bishop, asking, you know, are you going to continue pinning my knight? No, it retreats now, and Adams takes it off. So no more pressure on this diagonal. So we have hg, which does a repair to the pawn structure, but it does leave white with seemingly dominating position on e5, and black playing e5 seems highly fictional at this point to liberate that e6 pawn. So if it's a fixed target, it's a potentially losing target if it can be snapped up later. And so how would Adams arrange more pressure? Well, he plays a very interesting move here, rook e3. So he's preparing just in advance of knight d7. Well, he's always got rook takes e6, that wasn't even the threat. So what is the purpose of rook e3? Well, it adds a bit more protection on f3, and it also means white can potentially treble on the e file. So bishop d6, white now plays knight e5. He doesn't mind if bishop e5, he'll probably just well, this might be the point of the previous move. It gives another option really to take with the pawn. Or in this position, in fact, rook e3 gave the opportunity for knight e5, so that's another point. So there's various points, and you might think I'm trying to guess what the point is, and you'd be right. So bishop d6, the knight comes into e5, not worried about bishop e5. Okay, so rook f4. Now we do see a trebling possibility though. Now queen e2, but first rook, before the rook e1, we see knight df3. And now finally the trebling on e5, and look at this, this is a wonderful grip on the dark squares. So rook g7, can black generate some counterplay, maybe g5, g4, but where is it all heading? This doesn't seem to be a menacing attack. In fact, Adams plays g3. Maybe you can argue this is a prophylactic type move, just in case there's going to be any trouble. Bishop e7, now king g2, so he's tightening up the king side and f3. Now queen d2, he's reshuffling actually the battery. We saw this in another instructive game from the British, where, or rather a reference to a past game, where the battery is rearranged systematically. And here, Adams is first probing a little bit, and now also discouraging g5 with this quite committal move h4. So he's trying to shut down black's options. And in fact, black obliged here to shut down g5 a little bit more, in effect, by playing h5, because now g5 will be left with this terrible pawn, and it seems white's got a good stranglehold on g5 now. Knight d3. Okay, the rook comes to f3, hitting f3. The other knight goes to e5, getting out of the way, and also this knight can now come to f4. So it's fairly unpleasant for black. Now knight f4 here. Bishop h4 is not working now because actually the queen's enough to protect the knight. The rooks aren't doubled or anything. So queen c8. So what is black doing? He doesn't seem to have much of a game. The game's kind of lifeless here. You would say, you know, that the source of potential counterplay seems to have backfired. It's like freezing up. The black position is literally becoming frozen here. And what is Adams doing now with this knight h3? Well, actually now he rearranges his battery, or he starts to, knight f3, and finally rook e2. So now he's giving the possibility of queen e1, getting 3 pieces nicely arranged on e6. First knight fg5 though, so he's got 3 pieces now, and that becomes a 4th, and in fact the pawn's dropping off here. And you see that this knight on h3 is doing a nice duty of protecting f2 against the rooks. So white's clearly won the positional battle and is going material up now. So knight takes e6, so winning a pawn, and there doesn't seem to be much compensation for black. Rook e3, queen comes to e2 now, maybe rook f3 if Adams wanted it, but actually he plays queen d3. Now rook e2, so sort of seemingly waiting for another weakness. So white's a comfortable pawn up, and maybe he's trying to find another constructive plan, or waiting for another concession for black. So he doesn't do the exchange of queens here, which is rather instructive as well. He waits for a better moment where there's more advantage to be gained from a queen exchange. He first now plays knight f4. Where is this knight heading? Maybe e6 to c5, maybe to start attacking the queen side. Queen c8 was played. Okay. Now in this position, knight h3 was played. So why not knight e6? You might be wondering. Knight e6 might be a good move as well. In fact, let's engine check this position. Why couldn't this move be played? It's seemingly an attractive move. Or was there a queen sack here? No, I don't think so. Bishop g7. White's just clearly better in this position as well. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. But Adams, he played knight h3, so he's still, I don't know, keeping just all his trump cards without any risk. So now finally an infiltration with the queen, and if the queens came off here, the white rook is so well placed compared to before. It's really in white's favour. Now rook e6, putting pressure maybe on g6 as well. The bishop can't move, and knight f4 is going to be a pain. Okay, now queen c8. So again, not exchanging queens there. It wasn't that advantageous. The knight's comfortably protecting the f2 at the moment, so there's no tricks with like bishop d4 or bishop h4. But g5 was played, and here Adams simply plays rook e2. This was a major concession that Adams was looking for, and tactically now, white is threatening queen takes f5, and if king g6, there's some little tricks almost available to white, like g4, and if it takes h5, if the king's really going to be protecting f5. The king did come to protect f5 here, because if bishop e7, there's rook e7. So if queen e7, queen f5. So how many ways to protect this rook? And it's an embarrassment. That g5 was really the final straw to really collapse the black position quickly. Maybe he just had enough. So hg. Now Adams simply took on g5, and now exchanged off queens, and simply played rook e5, and to this black resigned. So it was like a strangulation on both sides of the board. With black's potential for f-file counterplay, it was never more than a fairy tale. If we look in overview and summary carefully now, so the advanced variation does seem to have a lot of bite to it, where white's not trading off the light squared bishops, but that bishop is an annoyance because it's sort of impeding black's development a bit on the king side. So black has to waste time with a move like bishop g6. And now Adams' first plan was to clamp down on queen side counterplay, so he's discouraging this move c5 from black, so black can't undermine the exploitable base of the pawn chain, which is this pawn. So later he has to try and exploit the head of the pawn chain, the e5 pawn. So in doing so, there's this major concession, this backward e pawn on the semi-open e file, and maybe against lesser players there'd be some some cheapos, some tactical opportunities on f3 or f2